A very good evening. Hannah McInnes here on Times Radio, sitting in for Carol Walker. Well, inflation has today hit a 40-year high at 9.1%. It sparked further concern about the impact of vulnerable people in society. The rising cost of fuel, food and energy bills poses a particular threat to those on limited income, like pensioners, but also younger people. According to research by Student Beans, 1 in 20 students are using food banks and half of them are skipping meals. Earlier, I spoke to Caroline Abrahams, charity director at Age UK, and to Jason Reed, who's the founder of Young Voices UK, a network for young political commentators. I began by asking Caroline how the news of the rise in inflation is going to affect pensioners.
Well, we know that a lot of pensioners on low incomes and even middle incomes have been struggling to pay their basic bills. And so this is another kind of, blow really for them, just as it is for everybody in our society. I guess the difference being that older people are on a fixed income generally, and so have really very few options when prices really do soar as they are at the moment.
And so to just complete the picture, Jason, how would you say you personally and students are impacted? And when they hear of inflation being at such a record high, what's the impact on students?
Well, I'd turn that question on its head. What isn't the impact on students? It seems that every single outgoing is going up. We're already paying a huge proportion of our income in rent. Every single bill, utility bills, food bills, the cost of clothes, everything is going through the roof. The dream of buying a house seems much, much further away with every month that passes. And we've got the government saying that we mustn't have wage increases to keep up with inflation, just in case that causes an inflationary spiral. So the economic news coming out is very, very depressing. It looks very close that we won't be able to afford to live for a lot of people.
So do you feel bitter, I suppose, when you hear that there are things being put in place to help pensioners? Rishi Sunak obviously said today, defending the triple lock pension system will see pensions rise in line with inflation. Jason, first, do you feel that the priority is wrong?
Well, it certainly does seem like there's a little bit of an imbalance going on. It seems that pensioners get special treatment that nobody else gets. And of course, we don't want anyone to be living in poverty, and we want to minimize the impact of this inflationary crisis on everybody. But it does seem that young people are the ones who tend to fall through the cracks. House prices continue to go up so fast that even when wages are growing, they just cannot keep up. The proportion of our income that is being spent on essentials like rent and food and energy bills is much, much higher than any generation that goes before. Since the 1930s, the current generation of millennials, people in their 30s, are the first generation ever to earn less than those born 10 years before them. It seems that all the news is depressing, but the government, frankly, doesn't seem to be interested. They're more interested in handouts for older people and letting young people manage on their own.
I mean, Caroline, it must be quite hard hearing that. Do you think Jason is right, or do you think this whole idea that you're sort of being pitted against each other is not helpful?
Oh, I think life is really tough for young people, as it is for many people in our society. But I work for an older people's organisation, and I think some of the commentary today and yesterday about older people has been a bit ill-informed, to be honest. At the moment, the state pension gives you about £8,000 to £9,000 a year. Some people are on rather less, depending on their circumstances. And even if the triple lock stays in place, as I very much hope it will, it might edge closer to £10,000 a year. But that's not a great deal, and it's considerably less than it is in some other comparable countries.
So you don't think that the triple lock being defended, seeing pensions rise in line with inflation, as we've heard today, that doesn't make your sort of heart leap with joy? You don't think that's enough?
Well, older people, even after the triple lock comes into force, will still, a lot of them, be pretty out of pocket because of the enormous scale of the energy price rises that we're all facing, young people and older people alike. And that's the problem. It's absolutely unprecedented, isn't it, to see prices going up like this? And all the news, all the projections for the autumn is that things are going to get a lot worse, and they're talking about an average of 3,000 a year. And, I'm my job is to talk about older people, but I have every sympathy for people from all walks in life, particularly those on lower incomes, who are really frightened at the prospect of how they're going to manage this winter.
Jason, Caroline, as she says, represents older people. You represent younger people. But, the government can't help everyone. Do you have sympathy with the idea that actually perhaps the older population, the older parts of the population need help now more than the young, and therefore they are the priority?
Well, of course, we have sympathy with people who need help at any time, whatever age they are. But the fact is that the government's policies are just much more generous towards older people than they are younger people. Things like the winter fuel allowance, for example, are not even means tested. And so even if you're a middle class or a very wealthy older person, you still get those extra payments that you don't need. It's hard to overstate just how significant this crisis that young people are facing is at the moment. I think a really compelling example is through the lens of fertility and family planning. Many people my age in their 20s and slightly older as well in their 30s are just not able to have the kids that they want to have because they can't afford it. They certainly can't afford, in most cases, to buy a house. They can't afford to live the life they want to live because they're living payslip to payslip, just struggling to pay their rent and cover their utility bills. And meanwhile, pensions are going up. We've got winter fuel payments that are not means tested for older people. Of course, ideally, we'd have lots of money to give to everyone, but there is very clearly a double standard going on. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that Britain at the moment is a bit of a gerontocracy. The older people have got a very, very good deal, and the younger people are being screwed over.
Caroline, do you agree that it's a gerontocracy? I mean, I suppose it's interesting, Jason's point about it's not means tested. So there are people benefiting who don't need to, while people of Jason's age group are suffering who shouldn't.
Well, I think, as we all know, we live in a very unequal society, and we have people who are better off and people who are less well off. And that cuts across all age groups. And actually, the differences in wealth are greater within generations than they are between them. And the reason that some older people are well off isn't because of the state pension. It's because they have private pension wealth or they have housing wealth. And that's what the tax and benefit system is for. The tax system is there to tax people fairly. And, people will have different views about whether the current system we have is fair or not. But really, to that extent, the state pension is a bit of a red herring, really. It's not going to make the difference to somebody who's very well off. The problem with means testing, though, is it doesn't work with older people, which is why we don't support means testing the winter fuel payment at Age UK. Because the problem is we know that there's absolutely all the evidence tells us that, older people don't claim their benefits. That's why 1 in 3 of the very poorest older people who are entitled to extra help don't get it.
I mean, Jason, first of all, perhaps you could answer what Caroline has just said there, but also, what do you think the government should be doing then to support younger people, but not to the detriment of older people? Because there's a social contract, really, isn't there, in this country that we've always hoped exists. And you don't want to pit the young against the old. You want to do the absolute opposite.
Well, I don't want to do that, but I feel that the government is doing that. Some of what Caroline said is absolutely right. Of course, older people's wealth does not stem primarily from the state pension. As she said, they have huge amounts of other wealth to draw on, and that just plays into this dynamic of the gerontocracy that I'm talking about, such as through home ownership. So many older people, even if they have low incomes, are sitting on huge assets, huge amounts of wealth that people my age can only dream of. And so there is this huge imbalance going on. There are plenty of things the government could do to help young people in similar ways to the way they've helped older people. But it seems that the moves that they're making actually make things worse for young people, such as increasing national insurance contributions, such as increasing the interest rates for student loan repayments, all these things that are just more nails in the coffin to young people's dreams of being able to start a family and own a home.
What would you like to see them do?
Well, first of all, I'd like to see a stop to those things I mentioned. I don't want to be paying higher, we've got the highest tax burden since the Second World War. But I would like to see just a little bit more basic support, a few more means-tested payments for young people to help with their energy bills. And I would like to see, ahead of everything else, much more house building. I think we have a very serious problem with housing supply, with, I'm afraid, often older people in local authorities campaigning against planning applications and engaging quite a bit of NIMBYism to prevent young people being able to buy houses. And no wonder the house prices keep going through the roof. And so I think there are some quite basic things that the government could do to help young people. It's just decided that it would rather have elderly people voting for them rather than spending the money on young people.
Do you think that's right, Caroline? Do you think this is all politics, that the government are putting these plans and policies into place because they just want to keep the vote of the older generations?
Well, that's a question for you to ask our politicians rather than me. I work for a charity, and that's not my business. On house building, I think, of course, we're way behind where we should be in terms of building enough homes for our growing population. But to be honest, if only it was as easy as people being resistant in communities about wanting more housing, or it all being older people. I'm afraid that's just not the case. The government policy towards house building has been an utter failure. That's the problem. It's not older people's fault. So, I think probably there's a lot of common ground, really, between everybody in our society. And I just regret, this kind of debate, really, which I think there are hordes of older people who are really worried about the younger people in their families or their friends and neighbours, and they want them to be okay as well.
That's what I was going to say. I'm so sorry to interrupt. That's exactly what I was going to say to you, Caroline, which is, there's so much common ground. You clearly care that for the young, and what Jason says is not something you would wish on them. I can hear that. So I suppose what I'm saying in terms of the government are doing this perhaps politically, but you don't benefit from this pitting of the old against the young, which seems to be happening.
No, that's right. I think it's a concern. A strong society is one in which there's a lot of solidarity across people of all kinds, regardless of background or age. And the problem with this debate is it tends to undermine it. But this is against the context in which young people's interests, particularly those of better off young people, their life chances aren't as good today, I think, as they were, say, a generation or two ago. And I think that is a real concern in our society and does need to be addressed. And I speak as someone who used to work in the children and young people sector. So, I have every sympathy for younger people, but it's not about young versus old, really. I think that's, and most people would agree with us. And there's some, lots of very strong relationships within families, and long may that last. Yeah,
absolutely. And just one thing, as you say, not young and old related, to do with some recent data from Age UK. It showed that pensioners are missing out on the £150 council tax rebate. You were saying, it's not as simple as black and white, perhaps, as Jason was saying. Why is that?
Well, it depends on what their situation is. In fact, those aren't the only older people we know are missing out. So if you're somebody who's off the grid and you heat your home through oil, for example, which is true of lots of people in rural areas, then you may well be missing out. If you're on a prepayment meter, which happens to young people and older people, there's question marks over how easily it is to access the extra help. And there are, approaching 100,000 older people living in static caravans, park homes, so they're not eligible for any help either. So it's not quite true to say that every older person has benefited from the package so far, but they're all going to be worrying about their bills come this winter. So that's why the triple lock is so important, we think.
Jason, have you felt more persuaded hearing this?
Well, I'm very encouraged to hear what Caroline's saying, but I'm afraid it seems like a lot of it is empty words, because there don't seem to be any of the radical proposals that we would need to address the wild dynamic of gerontocracy in this country. I think we need a quite radical agenda of tax cuts and of allowing young people to keep their own wealth and grow their own wages and buy their own houses, none of which is coming from what Caroline is saying. All she's saying, it seems to me, is that older people haven't benefited quite as much recently as some people are claiming they have. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't find that particularly compelling or heartrending when young people are in the situation that they are.
But that's obviously, of course, not down to Caroline, that's down to government. I mean, and I would finish by asking you if you feel that you can see any sort of an end to this inflation set to rise further. Do you feel any optimism at all, particularly given, your job rallying the forces? Do you feel optimism that more voices will come together and you'll get some of the change you want to see?
I really hope they will. I think that there is still hopefully a place within Britain and within British politics for common sense and for a positive, forward-looking, pro-growth mindset rather than just kind of hoarding wealth and sitting on it and letting the younger generation fend for themselves. I think that the Tory party talks a good game about believing in the free market and low taxes and a small state. We haven't really seen that recently, but hopefully in the next few years we will see a bit of a turnaround. We will see the tax burden start to shrink again, which is long overdue, and that could potentially begin to unleash some wealth for young people, which is badly needed.
Well, that was Jason Reed, founder of Young Voices UK, and Caroline Abrahams, charity director at Age UK, talking there.